Let's look at Genesis 17, which I'm calling God's operating system upgrade, refinements to the Abrahamic Covenant. Some of us use computers a lot, and sometimes it is highly frustrating when something goes wrong and you don't know how to deal with the problem. How many Microsoft support staff does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is 4. One to ask, what is the registration number of the light bulb? One to ask, have you tried rebooting it? Another to ask, have you tried reinstalling it? And the last one to say, it must be your hardware because the light bulb in our office works fine. So we're going to look now at God's operating system upgrade. That's really what we're dealing with in Genesis chapter 17. Of course, every computer has an operating system, whether it's Windows 10 or Apple's Mac OS or Linux or whatever it is. It's a system designed to help you navigate your way through the digital world. But what every human being needs is an operating system that will help them navigate their way through the real world. And God provides such an operating system. It's certainly not Apple after what happened in the Garden of Eden, even if the fruit eaten then wasn't actually an apple. But God's operating system is called covenant. And everything God does in this world and in history is by way of honouring and fulfilling the obligations and commitments he has placed on himself through the covenants he has made with people. And at the point reached in Genesis chapter 17, God has determined to do all this through a covenant that he has made with Abram. It was formally initiated in Genesis chapter 15, and now at least 13 years later, God does an upgrade on this operating system. He introduces some fresh refinements. There's some new features to this program. For example, God now reveals himself to Abram as El Shaddai, God Almighty. Now back in Genesis 15, God related to Abram as Yahweh, Lord. And similarly, when God first formalizes the covenant with Jacob, it is as Yahweh. And when he reaffirms this covenant, it is as El Shaddai. Parallel, isn't it? In Genesis 15, God stressed what he would do to honour the covenant. In Genesis 17, he emphasises what he expects his people to do. Now you can see this immediately in how God speaks to Abram. I am El Shaddai, walk before me and be blameless. I will confirm my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers. So Abram is being asked to model himself on Enoch, who walked with God, then he was no more because God took him away. That's Genesis chapter 5 verse 24. And especially on Noah, a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked with God. Genesis chapter 6 verse 9. So given the way that Abram and Sarai behaved so badly with respect to Hagar in the previous chapter, this exhortation to be like Noah is highly relevant. God confirmed his covenant with Noah and promised to greatly increase his numbers, and now he does the same with Abram. Now it's significant when you read verse 3 that we read that Abram fell face down in the presence of God. Now that's the first time he does this in his encounters with God. And significantly, this is the 7th occurrence of this verb nafal. And 7 is the number of perfection, and so this perhaps implies that falling on one's face before God is the ultimate way of expressing relevance. And we'll see the number 7 seems to crop up a bit in this chapter. I'm sure you've all heard of Mark Sinclair Vincent, otherwise known as Vin Diesel. How about Karen Johnson? Whoopi Goldberg? Cassius Clay, well that's a nice easy one. I think most of us know who Cassius Clay was. Muhammad Ali. Reginald Dwight? Elton John. How about Morris Micklewhite? Who was that? Michael Caine. Ilyena Mironov. Ilyena Mironov? Helen Mirren. Eric Blair. George Orwell. Eric Weiss. Harry Houdini. Charles Dodgson. Lewis Carroll. Now in all these cases, individuals changed their names to make themselves more successful. and they succeeded in making a name for themselves. But they've probably had little impact on shaping your moral character or my moral character, and even less on the course of human history, except in very trivial ways. But one name change has enormous significance for your life and mine, and for all who live on the face of the earth. And this is not a case of an individual choosing to rename himself, to make a name for himself. This is a case of God renaming Abram and calling him instead Abraham. So another new feature of God's upgraded operating system is the giving to Abram of a new name. Now, on both occasions when God appears to Abram and Jacob as El Shaddai, he gives each of them a new name. Isn't that interesting? And Abram becomes Abraham and Jacob becomes Israel. Abram means exalted father. Now, that's a bit of a joke, really, isn't it? Because Abram's now 99 and he has but one son whom he has obtained in a way which contravenes God's purpose. And it's stretching it even to call Abram a father, and certainly not one bathed in honour at this point. And God now seems to be making the situation even more absurd. He renames this 99-year-old man as Abraham, the father of many, that is, the father of many nations or peoples, promising that future kings will arise from among his descendants. There's a little girl who asked her father, "Daddy, do all fairy stories begin with once upon a time?" And he responded, "No, there is a whole series of fairy tales that begin with, if elected, I promise." Now, if we elect God on the basis of his promises, are we being childish? Are God's promises the stuff of fairy tales? I mean, just take verse 8. God promises Abraham and his descendants the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession. Now, the word translated everlasting, olam, literally means beyond the horizon. Now, in this case, it means sometime in the distant future that is difficult to perceive. Just look at verse 13. My covenant in your flesh is to be an everlasting covenant. Now, the New Testament is adamant that the covenant of circumcision has been superseded, and that it is not necessary for even Jewish Christians to undergo circumcision. We read in Galatians chapter 5, for in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. Now, given this, it would be foolish to read verse 8 as a promise to give the land of Palestine to the Jewish people forever. In this passage, much hinges on what it will really mean to be the true descendants of Abraham. And the New Testament teaches us that what matters is faithfulness to the covenant, and not circumcision itself, which was supposed to symbolize this. So when we come to Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 16, God tells his people to circumcise their hearts and to stop being stiff-necked. Physical circumcision was supposed to be matched by spiritual circumcision. Now we come to the need for some downloading to take place. To enjoy the benefits of access to God's operating system, Abraham and his descendants had to download this operating system, to accept the covenant and commit themselves to stick with it. To replace it with some other operating system is precisely what is meant by committing idolatry. Now, I paid money to Christ College to gain access to an academic site that makes available scholarly articles for a vast range of journals which deal with theology and the study of the Bible. And having done this, I log in with the username that all Christ College users use, and I use the same password they all use. It's an institutional login. It's a corporate login. Now, to access God's operating system, the covenant, you have to use the corporate username and the corporate password. And the corporate username is circumcised, because you have to be a circumcised member of Abraham's household or a descendant through his wife Sarah to have access. Otherwise you were denied access and cut off from communicating with other users. And the password is Isaac. Also, in the digital world, we are constantly asked to tick a box which says, I have read and agreed to the terms and conditions. And time and again we tick that box, without having read a single word of the terms and conditions. And that is precisely the behaviour God will not accept from the members of Abraham's household and his future descendants. He expects them all, including you and me, to keep his covenant, and like Abraham, to walk before him and be blameless. Now in verse 11 we read, "You are to undergo circumcision, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and you." In no other chapter of the Hebrew Bible does the word or the noun covenant, berit, occur as often as in Genesis 17. It occurs 13 times in this chapter. And this is the 7th occurrence of this word in verse 11. It reads, "You shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between you and me." Now, as the 7th occurrence out of 13, this makes this statement the central one. I think the number 7 is very important in this chapter. Circumcision is a sign. It's a sure sign. Well, a sure sign is evidence that something is happening or definitely true, and a circumcision is a sure sign. It's God's way of saying something is about to happen, so prepare yourselves. Abraham is about to have a son, and from him an immense number of descendants. And indeed, it's a telltale sign as well, isn't it? Because circumcision involves the male reproductive organ as a way of telling everyone at the time that Abraham can expect to have lots of descendants. And on top of that, the sign of circumcision is a warning sign. Now that's made clear by the pun in verse 14. "Any uncircumcised male who has not been circumcised in the flesh will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." So either the descendant of Abraham allows for the cutting off of the foreskin, or it will end with the cutting off of the descendant. Now verse 14 provides another example of how the number 7 assumes significance in this chapter, because prior to this the word male has always been used together with female, and this is the first time that the word male stands alone, and it is the 7th use of this word in Genesis. The phrase sign of the covenant is precisely the same phrase used in chapter 9 to refer to God's setting of the rainbow in the clouds. Now you remember, whenever the rainbow appears, this is what God says. He says, "I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind." And so this sign of the covenant serves as a reminder to God to honour his commitment to the covenant. In a similar way, circumcision, as the sign of the covenant that God makes with Abraham, is a reminder to Abraham and his descendants to honour their commitment to the covenant. Now circumcision was practised in many ancient societies. It was practised among men in Anatolia, in the Western Sudan, by Australian Aborigines, by the Maasai of East Africa, by Polynesian men, and by Egyptians and many Semitic peoples. Abraham was also Semitic, but Babylonians and Assyrians didn't practice circumcision. And typically when practised it was a rite of passage, a way of saying that a boy has become a man. And Israel is quite unique in applying circumcision to babies when they were 8 days old. In other societies, circumcision was a sign that a male had achieved something. The circumcision of Israelite babies meant that they were beneficiaries of the covenant with God, even though they hadn't achieved anything. In other words, obedience for Abraham's descendants was not required to get into the covenant and enjoy its benefits. Obedience was required of those who were already in the covenant. And similarly, we don't earn the right to enter the new covenant and enjoy its blessings by what we do. We are called to live godly, obedient lives, but after we have already been admitted to the covenant, rather like the babies in Genesis chapter 17. Now it is common for Christians to see infant baptism as mirroring Old Testament circumcision. And there are some parallels to be sure. The New Testament understanding of the solidarity of the Christ-honouring household makes infant baptism a very valid practice, and here I part company with many of my peers. I can't see that the New Testament ever treats baptism as the New Testament replacement of circumcision. But that's another story. We'd have to look at that on a separate occasion. But it should be noted that circumcision is not a sign of Jewish ethnicity. In verse 12, God commands, "For the generations to come, every male among you who is 8 days old must be circumcised, including those born in your household, or bought with money from a foreigner, those who are not your offspring." And foreign slaves are included. God cares for the foreigner among his people, even those of lowly status. And so we can see here how Genesis 17 sort of hooks on to Genesis 16, where we saw God's concern for Hagar, a foreigner of low status. And indeed God reminds Abraham that Abraham himself is an alien in Canaan. And the rest of the chapter makes such a big thing of Ishmael's circumcision. It does make a big thing of it, doesn't it? And so it's a mark of the fact that Ishmael is inseparably linked to Abraham and therefore will live his life under the blessing of God. And God will make him into a great nation, as promised in verse 20. So it's not a mark of Jewish ethnicity. That's very important to notice. So now we come to the need to distinguish between right and wrong passwords. Now, I don't know whether you find the same thing, but I find computer passwords an absolute pain in the neck. And they have profoundly entered our culture. Indeed, yesterday at Campbelltown Hospital, a woman gave birth and announced, "I'm going to call him David." And she was told that this name had already been taken, but she could call him David 674. Now, her husband was sitting at the family computer. "Honey," he asked his wife, "what is the password?" "Our wedding anniversary," she replied. And her husband muttered to himself, "She did that on purpose." Would you believe that I changed my password to incorrect, so that whenever I forget it, I will be told, "Your password is incorrect." Now, it took a little time for Abraham to learn how to log in to this upgraded operating system, because he made the mistake of entering the wrong password, Ishmael. You know, he wanted Ishmael to be the one through whom the blessing would flow, but he was told instead that the password to use was Isaac, not Ishmael. Now, when God told him that he was to have a son through Sarah, who was about to turn 90, he laughed and said to himself, "Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? The only time in the chapter that Isaac's descendants are spoken of, rather than of Abraham's descendants, is in verse 19. "Yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him." The word descendants is of great importance in this chapter, and it is significant that this statement is the 7th use of this term. And that number 7 again, it keeps coming up, doesn't it? Now, God deliberately gets Abraham to call his son Isaac to remind him that when God said he would give him a son through Isaac, his response was to laugh at the very idea of such a thing happening. Now, I do not think Abraham's laughter was an expression of disbelief and incredulity. Yes, he was concerned about the implications of such a development for Ishmael, but he was not rebuked for his laughter, and I think we should see it as an expression of his delight. On one occasion, Jesus told hostile Jews that though they were physically descended from Abraham, they were not, in fact, his children, not his true descendants. And he went on to say, "Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad." That's John chapter 8, and it would seem that Jesus may well have had in mind the laughter of Abraham at the thought of offspring coming through Sarah that would result in the whole world experiencing the blessing of God. Amen.